The goal of today's video is to figure out how a particular protein that cattle have called the myostatin protein, we're going to figure out how that protein is related to the muscle size that we see in cattle, whether cattle are heavily muscled, have medium-sized muscled, or more typical muscles. So just to review, we have already looked at two other proteins that have a lot to do with muscles as well, the actin and the myosin. So remember, these are protein molecules, and they help us move our muscles, and they also help build our muscles. So when the actin and myosin come touch, they pull together, and our muscles contract. And when those proteins release from each other, our muscle cells relax, and so they contract and they relax. And when we go and build new muscle, so if you're lifting weights or doing some kind of resistance training and you get sore, you have little micro tears that are in your muscles, and then those cells build themselves back up again. And at the same time they do that, they become bigger muscle cells because there's more actin and myosin that's being added to those cells. So myostatin is a protein as well. And this is a picture right here of what a typical myostatin protein looks like. And so it's made up of lots of little particles. You can see there's probably hundreds of particles in here, and it has this sort of characteristic V shape. And this protein is connected to that muscle type trait that we've been looking at in the cattle. So let's dig a little bit into how it's connected. So it turns out that cells, so we've got a little cell over here in the corner here. So many cells have what are called receptors on the outside. So they kind of are they're a physical structure that generally sticks outside of a cell membrane. So the cell membrane is the outside of the cell here. And basically receptors take messages from outside of the cell and bring those messages into the cell, and then the cell does something with those messages. In the case of myostatin, here's your typical myostatin protein. Again, it has that kind of sideways V shape. And if you notice, this V shape fits really nicely over here in this receptor. So it's kind of like a key fitting into a lock. So when the myostatin protein comes up to the cell, it fits into the receptor and it sends a message into the cell. So when lots of myostatin proteins send messages into lots of different cells, what you see is muscle tissue that gets formed. So again, we've got the V shapes fitting perfectly into the receptor cell. The message is sent, and then we have lots of muscle cells being formed, and we've got typical muscles developing. So this is what normally happens. But as you remember from the activity that we did in class, there are actually two variations of the myostatin protein. So the first variation 1 is what we're going to call it, is complete. All the particles are packed really closely together, and we're going to call it fully formed. The second variation is only partially formed. So you can see that there's little gaps throughout. It's still, it looks kind of a similar shape, but it's kind of gappy. And so we're going to call that a partially formed myostatin. So the partially formed myostatin, variation 2, it turns out it doesn't fit into the receptor. So the receptor has this sideways V shape, and when the myostatin protein, number 2, tries to fit, it doesn't. It can't fit. And so what that means is the message is not sent to the inside of the cell that it has. And as a result, there is no message sent into the cell. And when the muscle tissue develops, you actually get these extra big muscles forming. Now, we also know that some animals, from the activity that we did in class, can have one protein molecule that is variation 1 and one set of protein molecules that is variation 2.